Hello, everyone. I am speaking to you from a cold, rainy day in Greenville. For those of you who are here, you are experiencing the same thing. I wanted to touch base and give you a kind of a video lecture this time about what you read, and hopefully I can help you move through some of the ideas and let you know more about why it was that I chose this piece for us to read about the Chicago School. So I wanted to actually start by showing you a cartoon. This is a book called the New Yorker American Sociological Association Book of Sociological Cartoons. And so this one says it's a man sitting in a chair. This was back in 1986. Sitting in a chair in a living room, and his little boy is looking up at him. And the man says, "I'm a social scientist, Michael. I can't explain electricity or anything like that, but if you ever want to know about people, I'm your man." So here it is. So those of you who are on campus, I wanted you to know about an event I'm organizing next week. I have it here in the PowerPoint. I know at least one or two of you are also in my senior seminar, so you'll get to meet the speaker because she's speaking to our class. And I wanted to um, just start by talking about what's the use of theory. You're probably wondering that. Why am I studying theory? Because maybe some of you aren't going to become theorists. In fact, it's probably the case that nobody's going to become a professional theorist or philosopher in the future. But if you're like me, you enjoy learning about ideas in liberal arts education because that is what it's about. And this is the time when you have the dedication and the resources and the time to actually explore a lot of these ideas. So, um, yeah, I do hope you've built your knowledge of classical theories in sociology for a number of reasons. And one is that some of you may go to graduate school in a social science field, and these might be important. And some of you may be going into applied work like social work, which also these theories can speak to. And you also never know what might come up, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. So in my opinion, it's not that scholarly learning is to be only about the practical use, right? But it's also about expanding your understanding of ideas, how they're generated, and the theoretical shoulders that sociologists are standing on. And even though some of you are sociology minors, I'm considering you to be sociologists as well. So in this article you read about the Chicago School, as you read, they went through this debate of whether to build theory as they started to build the field of sociology. The field of sociology was just starting to become a discipline at the time. And the question is, should we build theory or should we focus on the urgent social problems of the city, including urbanization, poverty, social needs, the issues facing immigrant communities, etc. If you think back to the beginning of the semester when we talked about all of the changes with modernization, with industrialization, and other types of changes that were going on, this Chicago was what the Chicago school called an urban laboratory. And that is, we have the opportunity to actually understand what's going on in the world right here in our city, in our local area. I'm just coming from a faculty meeting where we had a discussion about theory, and a faculty member that some of you actually may know, Jermaine McNair, talked about how theory has informed his work in building a nonprofit here in Greenville that works on the ground trying to address social issues such as disparities in Greenville. And for example, the name of his organization is Civil, NC Civil, and it's an acronym CIVIL for Community and Industry Value Interactionist League, a North Carolina nonprofit. And so the word interactionist is in there for a reason, because he is using some of the theoretical ideas of symbolic interactionism. So his own nonprofit organization is named for a theory. And I wanted to mention that the article that you read reminded me of my own graduate school, the New School for Social Research in New York. So if you remember in the article, they talked about how there were these debates between theorists and between sociologists, and that we think of the Chicago School as kind of one unit, as having some kind of singular mission, as having a certain set of ideas that everybody shared and that the students shared. But in reality, as you read, there were actually debates going on. There were people who didn't agree with each other, and students who took sides, or who, who went with one professor versus another, and that maybe we've been thinking about it all wrong. But it reminds me of my own graduate school experience at the New School for Social Research in New York, where we also had diversity of theories and ideas among our professors, like the Chicago School, and students would gravitate to one professor or another, and there were debates between the different perspectives. For example, you've been studying Durkheim, right? Uh, there was a debate about Durkheim. So I may have mentioned this already, but one professor wrote a paper called Useless Durkheim, and another one wrote a response paper which was called Useful Durkheim. And that debate never got resolved. I think at least one of those papers actually got published. And then another debate that happened between one of those professors and another professor was about how to understand and interpret social movements, meaning social protest movements. One professor was of the school that the movement should be analyzed by understanding how participants in the movement used resources such as money, such as networks, such as people, such as leadership tools and other things, access to the media, artistic resources, music, right? All of these ways that people use resources, access to spaces, access to policymakers. So this was someone who was focused on that way that you mobilize resources when you want to make change. The competing theory from a different professor, who didn't quite agree, said that we need to understand social movement actors, we call them actors, by looking at how they're motivated by ideas, by values, by morals. So by hearing that debate, can you kind of hear the echoes of what we've been talking about earlier this semester, of the importance, for example, that Marx would put on material resources, historical materialism, in contrast to Weber's approach, which is the way that values and beliefs motivate human action. Remember the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. So back to the Chicago School, after that little journey into my own graduate school history. As you read, the Chicago School not only drew on social scientific ideas as they tried to build a new field, and they pressed for its importance as a science, they also drew on other motivations, such as those who were coming from their own commitments to addressing social justice and poverty, and some of those came from their religious backgrounds. And as you read, some of those early professors were actually Christian ministers. And one had a background as a journalist who was out in the field and became interested in the people in the more forgotten parts of the cities, and that influenced his sociology and his change of fields to sociology. This article does cover an interesting debate about whether there is such a thing as the Chicago School. As I mentioned, it wasn't a unitary perspective. That's not something that needs to concern you in terms of why we're reading the article. I really wanted you to have an overview or a glance at the beginning of the field in this country on this side of the Atlantic, since we've been focusing on Europe earlier this semester. And some of the questions about where theory fits, or whether it fits in our work as sociologists or social scientists more general. Also, I wanted you to see that part of theorizing is actually creating ideas about what kind of empirical methods we're going to use. So you read about the way that the early Chicago school professors really invented the qualitative methods of ethnography and actually going into communities and spending time with them, interviewing them, writing up case studies, etc. And we also saw the birth of the theoretical perspective that we call symbolic interactionism, the way we try to understand face-to-face relationships. And we're going to see how that's used by Irving Goffman next week. Let me just say a brief point about what they mean by behaviorism. You read about how the Chicago school professors, sociology professors, were arguing against this theory of behaviorism. So basically, this is a psychological theory, if you haven't run across it before, that states that human behavior can be analyzed and understood by investigating how it's a response to some kind of external stimuli, right? That our behavior is being influenced by our environment in particular, almost automatic ways. So, as a student in elementary school or high school, you probably learned about Pavlov's dog, right? I think we all read about the way they were able to get Pavlov to salivate as he or she started to anticipate feeding times, right? Feeding places. And the way they were able to train the dog to manifest certain behaviors based on changing certain stimuli. So this same idea, this behaviorism, has been applied to humans. With the Chicago school, the debate was those who disagreed that humans are like animals or responding to the external stimuli, but we are actually thinking human beings with rationalities to our actions. And among the Chicago sociologists that developed ideas that challenged and contrasted with behaviorism were people like George Herbert Mead and Charles Cooley, who wrote about the socialization of children into our society and how our interactions with other people in our environments are actually instrumental in becoming members of society. You might have heard about Cooley's looking glass self, which is the way that a child starts to mimic the people around them. And if you think about dress up, for example, Halloween costumes and people dressing up like parents and putting on high heels and lipstick and suits, that the child starts to create the behavior and personalities that are copying the behaviors of other people around them, including their parents. But it's an active, kind of ongoing back and forth experience of socialization. It's not some kind of physical, automatic response to a stimulus. So this could be an interesting dinner conversation or party conversation with your friends, right? What motivates human action? I'd be curious if you get into that with someone. And returning to a point that I introduced earlier, you never know when you might find some of these theoretical ideas to be useful to you. So just understanding political actions on the global stage can be informed by some of the ideas that we've been reading. For example, understanding what Marx and Marxism was about is useful for understanding a good 100 plus years of cold wars and hot wars around the world, some of which our country has been very centrally involved with, many of those, as well as divisions that happen today, continue today, such as between the Western world and China, such as what's going on right now with Cuba and with Venezuela and other countries in Latin America. And another example of what I meant by you never know what might happen. Here's something that is not likely to be your experience, but my sister got the opportunity to be a German exchange student when she was in college, and she was a sociology major. And when she was in Germany, she met other sociology students, and they got very excited and asked her who was her favorite theorist. And she had not had a lot of sociological theory because, maybe because she hadn't quite gotten to theory yet in her education, but also many undergraduate programs, at least in the past, and many American sociology programs, it's structured around standard textbooks that don't go into theories very deeply. So I think she was a bit embarrassed not to enter those conversations. But even though not many people get to study abroad, this is a globalized world, and you never know who you might be interacting with from a place that has the curriculum that's structured around theories. So So I'm for your learning both what these early theorists talked about and what the field of sociology was built on, as well as what can we do with those and how can we apply them to real problems, to real issues, to ideas that are floating around today. And then to move on to something else I wanted us to think about today is, as you can tell, I've been trying to introduce you to the forgotten women of the founders of our disciplines, right? We've talked about Marianne Weber, we've talked about Mary Wollstonecraft, and these have not still gotten a lot of ink in our books and other writings about people who were instrumental in founding sociology. And the Chicago School is another example of that. I want to introduce you to Jane Addams, who you may have heard about, especially if you've studied any social work classes or maybe psychology, because she's the founder of the field of social work. But she was also a sociologist. She was living in Chicago at the time, at the beginning of the Chicago School, and she actually did define herself as a sociologist, even though she could not hold the role of a professor at that time in history, right? Like 19th century, early 20th century. She started an important program in Chicago called the Hull House, which is still a model for the social work profession. And in fact, there's a museum there. I have not been to that museum, but I would like to. It was a place that centered around taking care of the needs of the most downtrodden, including low paid workers, people without a home, people without jobs or in low paying jobs, people suffering the issues of transitioning into a new country and a new language. Um, and she had a lot of very, very interesting writings and publications in addition to her actual hands on work. Um, she did what we call applied sociology. She used the term social ethics in her work, and she did research. She used mapping, interviews, data collection, studied urban poverty, studied public policy, and she's known as the founder of the social settlement movement. She also was a contributor to a theory that we call pragmatism, which is basically just, how do we develop pragmatic approaches to social issues? She wrote a lot about the issues facing immigrant communities, so some of our first writing about immigration. She played a really key role in lobbying for juvenile courts, improving public sanitation, work on pressing forward for more rights for women because they could not yet vote. And she was really blending her sociology with a number of fields like social work and philosophy. She considered herself to be a sociologist. Again, she was not doing this as anyone making a salary or teaching classes or having a nice office in the beautiful buildings that you see in the slides here. But she published 5 articles in the American Journal of Sociology between 1896 and 1914. And this is one of the top 2 journals in sociology today. It's been around ever since that time. Very old journal and very, very difficult, at least these days, to get an article accepted. It was a time when there were fewer sociologists, so she maybe didn't have the kind of competition of many hundreds or tens or hundreds of thousands that are trying to get in that journal now. But I'm not downplaying the fact that she was published by a very, very prestigious journal. I put an image of her on the PowerPoint for you to help sort of you to visualize her as a flesh and blood person. And someone else that I want to mention that's relevant to this conversation about the Chicago School is W.B. Du Bois. And we'll talk about him later this semester. You're going to read this wonderful short piece of science fiction by him called The Comet. And even though it's the case that the Chicago School was the first established department of sociology, what's often overlooked, it's been overlooked for much of the time that sociology has been around, is that Du Bois taught at Atlanta University in Atlanta, Georgia, historically black university, because he couldn't get a job in a predominantly white university because of his race. And he was actually doing this exact type of community-based research that the Chicago School is known for, is famous for, in the late 19th century, before the Chicago School was established. And so there are some really good sociologists writing today trying to bring back the what we'll call the collective memory of that contribution that Du Bois made and hasn't been fully recognized for. Du Bois was also someone who was an activist, and he was one of the founders of the NAACP, which you probably know became extremely important during the civil rights movement. And as an aside, you might know that President Obama got his start doing community organizing in Chicago, in the South Side, which is actually a lower income area, mostly African American area, and it borders the University of Chicago. So, to wrap this up, this reading is a brief overview of the ideas at the beginning of our discipline that were not only theoretical, but grounded in actual social problems and the commitment to build a field that was trying to understand these social problems. And theoretically, the scholars were building a set of ideas that were important to try to understand these problems, as well as what kinds of methods should we use to be sociologists? What does it mean to use sociological methods? I hope this helps to fill in the background of our discipline here on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. Thank you and have a great weekend, everyone.